Thank you. I am really delighted to be here today, and thank you, Erin, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the provost and everybody else. I'm specifically excited because the theme of this conference marries two of my passions, obviously learning, that's what I study, that's my book, and that's what Erin was referencing, but B, the idea of inclusion, using learning principles to understand, to shed light on what it means to be more inclusive and where that can take us. And it's very fitting that we're doing this today, which is the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. So I wanted to acknowledge that it's a really fitting coincidence. So I'm going to start, this is the audience participation part. I'm going to start with a question for you. The first question is, can learning take place if in fact it silences the voices of the people it is supposed to teach? I see a lot of heads saying no. This is something that was asked of Henry Giroux, who is a cultural studies scholar and does his work in actually applied to education. And his answer was, yes. People learn that they don't count. We're always learning something. Learning is a process by which we elaborate our experiences and we extract meaning out of that. So we're all here today, we're all listening to the same things. Some of us will internalize that in a way that says, yes, I'm excited, I'm going to do more of that work. Some others might say, oh, that's all impossible to do, it's just futile, I'm not going to do it. That's what I've learned today. We're always learning something. And so our job as educators is trying to sort of predict all the ways in which students could take away messages from what we say and really highlight and bring forward the ones that are the most productive and the most inclusive. So I have studied learning with my colleagues back when I was at Carnegie Mellon. We did a literature review of all the stuff, well, not all, but there's a lot of research into learning, right? We looked at the past 50 years. What are the main themes that are emerging from this very interdisciplinary field, the learning sciences? Bringing insights from cognitive psychology, motivational psychology, developmental, from the School of Education, from the business school and learning in groups and learning as organizations, anthropological perspectives, and so on. And we looked at the insights that were coming up all over the place, that were reinforcing each other and that were validated and supported by research and empirical findings. And those are the things that we focused on, and we sort of highlighted the 7 that were the most, seem to be the most relevant, the most supported by research, and the most important to learning. We kind of organized them together into a set of principles. We focused, we didn't review everything, obviously that's impossible, but we tried to focus on the commonalities. There's a lot of individual differences in learning, but if we focus on the commonalities, everybody needs to pay attention for trying to learn something, if we're trying to become good at something. Everybody needs feedback to improve, and so on. So then if we focus on the commonalities, then our strategies will have the greatest impact for the most number of our students. And then also the bias that I want to highlight of the book is that it is culturally located and grounded in Western culture. Our very definition of learning that we use comes from a Western perspective. The studies that we review, we only looked at English language studies, so that's a limitation in and of itself. Out of usually the US, some Canada, some UK, but very specific. So it is located in a certain perspective. At the same time, my co-authors and I have been all around the world presenting these things. I've personally gone to Japan, Israel, Colombia, I'm forgetting some places, I'm sure. And we've all been really all over the world. And it has resonated so much that different audiences have asked us for translations in their own language, including Arabic, and Chinese, and Japanese, and Korean, Italian, I'm forgetting one, Spanish. So there is something that also went beyond where it started, that it resonated with people from other cultures. So that's how I am offering it to you. So today I wanted to take you through the 7 principles and give you a sense for what they are and what the research is behind them, and make some connections to the idea of diversity and inclusion. Really, I'm just scratching the surface here. We only have a little over an hour together. We can't solve all the problems of the world. So what I'm hoping this does is it provides a language for us, a common language for the day, and that it frames the rest of the day, in the sense that I looked at the program and there's a lot of breakout sessions really analyzing what inclusion might look like in terms of race and privilege and accessibility and global issues and so on and so forth. So the details and the unpacking will hopefully happen all throughout the day. What I'm hoping to offer is some evidence that can validate what you're already doing in the classroom. Maybe you don't know why. You have a sense that it works, that your students appreciate what you do, and this might validate and explain why. And it might also raise some questions for where to go next. I don't know. I did not come here to tell you how to teach. I don't know you. I don't know your students. I don't know your discipline. I don't know the context of your department. That would be very presumptuous of me. But I do have a spoiler. When we are through with this, inclusive teaching is excellent teaching. All the suggestions that come out of the literature on inclusive teaching are just good suggestions regardless. Help all students learn. They're not privileging one group in spite of another group. So here are the 7 principles. They're arranged in a somewhat loosely chronological order, in the sense that the first one is prior knowledge. Before the students get to us, to our courses, they know something already. And what they know matters for future learning. Not just how much they know, but the second principle talks about the quality of that knowledge, so the organization, how the knowledge is organized in the brain, what connections are allowed to happen, that also determines learning. And the way if you look at the principles, the way they are phrased is, this thing matters. It can facilitate learning if it's understood and incorporated well in the classroom or in the course. It can impede learning and or performance if not. So there are all sort of double-edged factors. The third one is motivation. That's also something that students bring with them before they come to us. But there's levers that we can actually use to modify that, increase that. So we need to understand that. 4 and 5 switch and talk about skill acquisition. How do we become good at something? Not just the memorization of the dates and the formulas and the theorems and the poems, but the skills. And so it talks about the kind of practice and the kind of feedback that we need to develop mastery and expertise. Number 6 is the most closely related to what we're doing today. It's a twofer. It's 2 principles in one, because we believe, after looking at the literature, that the personal maturity of the students matters for their learning, but also we have social environments where there is a profile of different kinds of developmental profiles, and they interact and they create a climate of personality, if you will, in the course that is more than the sum of the parts. It becomes an element that is in itself a determinant of learning. And so that's something that we will spend the whole day unpacking. And finally, when we're done with our students, we're not done. We just run out of time. But there's much more that we want them to learn about our fields that we can cover in the semester or the quarter or whatever time we have with them. And so we hope by the end that they have acquired enough tools to take responsibility for their own learning, to continue to learn how to learn and become a lifelong learner, all that kind of language. That's a hope, that's a good hope. but it needs specific things to happen along the way, otherwise it will not manifest. And so we need to understand what those are. So those are the 7 principles. So let's unpack one by one a little bit. I cannot tell you everything about each one, but I will sort of highlight one key element that I think might relate to diversity and inclusion. So prior knowledge. It matters. We're all very familiar with the ways in which it matters for good. Prior knowledge is the building blocks, and then we keep, stacking them on top of each other and getting higher and higher. It's the foundations. We need to dig deep and really build a solid foundation to be able to grow. What we don't think about enough, in my opinion, is the ways in which prior knowledge can be not good. Okay? So let's look at some of the ways in which it cannot be good. One important way is when we think we know something, but we are wrong. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to unlearn what we know before we can start building, stacking those Lego blocks on top of each other. This example comes out of Harvard. It's Professor Eric Mazur in physics who at some point in the 90s, he was an assistant professor, he started developing a sense that his students could solve the problems, work the equations, arrive at the final number that was the right number. But he suspected that they really did not understand what was going on in terms of physics principles. And so he started developing what he called concept tests to check students' understanding. He would just lecture for 10-15 minutes, which is the adequate amount that research says it's the attention span. Our brain will sort of go away after 15 minutes. And so he would break after 15 minutes, ask a question, multiple choice question. Not difficult in terms of the calculations. It's just the concepts. So if you understand what's going on, you should be able to tell me whether it's larger or the same or less. And then we can get at the calculator and actually calculate exactly how much more or how much less. But you should have a sense of the direction in which that answer is going to go, if you understand. And so he did those. This, by the way, first he did it by show of hands, then he did it with color-coded cards, then it became the clickers, and now we can do those on our cell phones. So that's where it all came from. So he has this one about blocks in water at different depths and how much force you need to hold them underwater if they're buoyant. And the answer is the same. It's B. It doesn't matter how deep. But he found out that 40% of the students actually had the right answer. That's not encouraging. Those are Harvard students. That's the cream of the crop. Okay? He also would ask them, how confident are you of your answer? And it was also 40% of students that were confident or very confident, except it was split equally in thirds. So some students were very confident, the same number of students were very confident about this or this or this. And so all possibilities all categories are possible. You could be confident, and you could be correct and confident that you're correct. You could be wrong and confident that you're right. That's the most dangerous one, right? And you could be right and not confident, and then we pair you up to discuss with the next person next to you, and then you shift to the wrong answer because you weren't as confident. So all that was going on in his class. And this particular one I always show because it illustrates a point where this is what psychologists might call an example of ontological miscategorization. If you're getting this problem wrong, what happens to the third light bulb when you close the switch? It's because you're thinking of electricity as a fluid. So if this was pipes and water in the pipes, half the water would go to C and half the water would go down. But electricity does not work like water. And so it would be half as bright, let's say. Electricity does not work that way. It goes everywhere at the same time. And so you have the wrong category in mind to reason about that. So he would ask this one, and some students raised their hands, and they said, Professor, do you want us to answer the way you taught us in class, or the way it really is? As if somebody, people go to Harvard to learn the way it really is not. And I mention that because it's important, because when I first started teaching statistics, I was aware of some of the misconceptions that students have, the big one being that association does not imply causation. Just because two things are happening at the same time plotted on a scatter plot, it doesn't mean that one is making the other one happen. But that's sort of the human mind is always looking for reasons and causes. And so I knew that there was a misconception, and so I thought, I'll tell them, and then they won't think that way because I told them. And this example shows that we can have two opposite, mutually exclusive conceptions in our brain. And the correct knowledge does not wash the bad knowledge out. It does not create that kind of cognitive dissonance that needs to be resolved automatically. You activate one when you think that's what the professor wants to hear, and then you revert to your old ways of thinking in the real world when there's not a grade attached to that. Okay? So that's bad news for us as educators. So let me add the second principle, and then we'll come back to what that means in terms of diversity and inclusion, that we cling to our ideas even when they're wrong. Second principle, the idea that it's not just how much you know and whether it's correct or not, it's what you do with that knowledge that matters. The studies that are really illuminating about this are the ones that compare experts and novices. And so what they show is that if we could open the proverbial brain and look inside, we would find networks inside the brain. Biological, neurological networks of neurons connected to each other, but also semantic networks. Networks of concepts that go together, right? That's true of everybody. That's how the brain works. It proceeds by making associations. But the networks that we find in the experts are, first of all, they're rich. So they're large networks. Experts know a lot. So you're going to see a lot of nodes and a lot of connections. Not everything is connected to everything else. The brain does not have the mental capacity to have all those connections activated at the same time. Okay? And also we don't want that. That's not helpful. You don't want every PowerPoint slide that you see to remind you of the lover that scorned you, or any other bad, unpleasant thing in your life. It's good that they're separate in the brain, in different places. But we want to have ways to get from one to the other in ways that are efficient. And so experts' connections are efficient. They're strategic. As a statistician, I would say that they allocate the degrees of freedom in that problem very efficiently and effectively. If you look at students, they will also have networks, neurological and semantic networks, but they're smaller. That's expected. They don't know as much. They're novices. So fewer nodes, fewer connections. The connections are not the right kinds of connections. And I don't mean right in the sense that there is only one way to connect things in the brain, only one way that knowledge should be thought of. But there are ways that are clearly wrong. There are ways that are not efficient, that won't get you from here to there as fast as you need to be going, for instance. So the question is, can students develop those better networks? And the answer is yes, but it's not automatic. We need to help them. Our role is not just to give students the knowledge, the bits and pieces, and say, you're smart, you can put them together in a way that makes sense. No, we also need to give them ways to put the knowledge together in ways that are productive, that help us do the discipline. And we should, if we check how they're putting the knowledge together, right away, like Mazur was doing, every 15 minutes stopping the lecture asking a conceptual question, then it will save us from disappointment, and the students from demotivating disappointment when they found out at the midterm that the way they've been putting it together did not make sense. I'm going to give you an example of that. This is another audience participation moment. I'm going to show a paragraph here on the screen, and I want you to read that paragraph out loud together. and then I'm going to ask you questions about the paragraph. And this is not a trick thing. I'm just going to ask you to summarize what you just read. I'm not going to ask you how many letter E's were in there, something that you couldn't possibly have paid attention to. It's not a trick question at all. Just summarize the thing. All right. So read it out loud. If the balloons pop, so who can summarize that? Let's start at the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy. Just straight up recall of what you just read. Who's a brave volunteer? Okay, what about the balloons popping? It's bad if they pop. It was a problem, right? Okay, so what else? Okay. What are some of the other things that could have gone wrong? The string could break.
The window's closed.
The window's closed. Insulation. Mm-hmm. The voice. What about the voice? If insulation is good, that's a problem because then the voice doesn't carry. Mm-hmm. What else? Yeah.
Lots of sentences about sound that didn't seem particularly related to one.
Okay. That's part of how this is, first of all, this is hard. Yes? And part of it is because it's bits and pieces that are sort of unrelated to each other. It's hard to understand why they, so the first level is recall, and it took like half a dozen people, and we recalled probably half of that paragraph. So we're going to give ourselves a pass. But the next level in Bloom's taxonomy is comprehension. What are we talking about?
Because we were all reading aloud, we were continuing to propel forward, so there wasn't any looping back to go, whoa, what was that? How's that connected?
You couldn't stop yourself. That's part of the artifice that I'm trying to create to illustrate the problem, for sure. But also because it doesn't give you clues. How many people are involved in this situation? You had to create a fantasy in your head. Where are we? How many people are there? Is it 2 people? Is it many people? Where are we? I've heard some people say to me before, maybe it's a birthday party, that's why there are balloons. What was the fantasy in your mind? I'm curious. Was it a birthday party? No? It's what?
I think it's a Dante Lillo novel.
Dante Lillo novel, okay. Very postmodern.
Multi-floor warehouse.
A multi-floor, there are floors, okay? It's a warehouse, maybe.
Building under construction.
Oh, under construction. I like that. Never heard that before. Okay? It's hard. It doesn't tell you. And so you have to overlay something onto it that helps you make sense of everything. And so if you were the one that said it's a birthday party and you show up to the exam and there's a question about balloons, you're going to get that question because that fit right in with the schema that you had to superimpose on that situation to understand it. If the question is instead about the window being closed, I don't know that you're going to do as well because that didn't fit, so maybe you didn't focus on that as much. Okay? I'm a big fan of second chances and redemption. So I'm going to give you another try, okay? How about now? Where are we? What is this? It's a serenade. It's romantic, right? It's a strange serenade where the speaker is being held aloft by the balloons. Now we know why it's a problem if the balloons pop, because that thing is going to come crashing down. But now we know that distance, that they refer to that, the distance is a problem to overcome, is actually vertical distance and not horizontal, which most people assume, except the one person who said it's multiple floors. Most people don't go there. They think it's horizontal. That's the string is the string of the guitar. And if it breaks, that's a problem. If the window is closed, that's why it's a problem, and so on. Okay? So all that is missing. If I told you up front, you don't even need the picture. If I had told you, imagine a serenade with the balloons holding up the speakers, it would have been much, much easier for you to remember that. Okay? And so the importance of framing, what I was saying before, giving students or learners a way to make sense of all the things. This is a particularly powerful one because if we diagram the connection structure of this piece, it's a hub and spokes. Serenade is here, and then balloons, window, voice, string. All those things are not connected to each other than through the serenade. So if I remove the piece of the serenade, now you're stuck trying to memorize 12 different things that don't really connect to each other. And also, I always like to point out, this is a smart audience. Like educators, professors, people with advanced degrees. And, I broke you just with this example from the 70s. Imagine a student trying to actually take in your whole discipline as a novice and how hard it is. Let me ask a couple questions, and those are questions, let them percolate in our brains, and we'll come back to that. Okay? When we talk about prior knowledge, what are some of the frames, some of the misconceptions maybe that students bring in that don't allow for a maximally inclusive and productive environment? And it might be frames and prior knowledge or assumed knowledge, misconceptions even about themselves, or it might be knowledge, presumed knowledge about other people. So there's a lot there to unpack, and we can come back to that. And B, what is our role in preventing some connections from being formed and allowing some other connections to being formed in terms of diversity and inclusion? For instance, I think of a case that was reported in the literature of a student in a geography class who wanted to do their final paper on gay neighborhoods. Why some cities have gay neighborhoods and some others don't? Where do they form in the city? Are there patterns? What functions do they serve in the sort of the economy of the whole city? And was told no, that had nothing to do with what they were studying in that class. But those are good geography questions to ask that could have applied to any kind of neighborhood, an industrial neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, a gay neighborhood. So it would have allowed all kinds of connections. But the instructor shut all of that down. And that was the entry point that student had found into geography. So we're shutting that down. So we need to think about our role. And that brings me to the third principle, which is motivation. That particular student, that was their motivation to sort of ask certain geographical questions. But in general, I hate this principle. I hate talking about this principle because I never think I can do it justice in like the 10 minutes that I spend on it. You could take like a graduate course in motivation. There's so many theories. The quick first pass is that most of the theories that people focus on explain motivation in two ways. One way is value. Students are more people. These are human theories. Humans are motivated to do things that they care about. There's nothing of this is, earth-shattering and surprising. And And so the question is, when they come in thinking they don't value math or statistics or X, Y, and Z, what can we do to make them value that? How do we build value into our courses? Or, related to diversity and inclusion, how do we tap into what they bring, which they already value because it's theirs and part of their identity and their background and history, and make it relevant to what we're talking about so that they reinforce each other? So that's the first level. The second level we don't focus on as much, and so I want to spend some time on this. It's the idea of expectancy. It's better understood in the negative, which is if we have an expectation that we're not going to be good at something, we're not even going to try. Because what is the point? We're going to fail. We have limited resources, our time and our mental energies, and we want to use them on things that will pan out. Okay? And so we need to ask, what creates the expectation that I'm going to succeed in a certain course, in a certain discipline, or not? And are those expectations aligned with reality? 3 things create expectations. One is the outcome expectancy, and that's a causal belief that what we're asking the students to do is connected to something that they value. If they don't see the connection, that's a non-starter motivation. We think about all the efforts about getting people to quit smoking. We know that smoking increases the risk of certain kinds of cancer. And people don't want to get cancer. Nobody wants to get cancer, okay? But they just don't buy that link. They have their uncle who smoked 4 packs a day their whole life and never got cancer, and the other uncle who never smoked and did get cancer, so it's not true, so I can do whatever I want. Ask yourselves, is there something like that at play in my courses? I have a lot of students, because I teach a gen ed statistics class, and so everybody has to take gen ed, nurses and dancers and everybody else, and the ones that can't really buy into that, none of what I'm asking them to do leads them to something that they value. The second thing is, even when that link is established, I see how doing this would get me here, which is where I want to be. I cannot travel that road. I am not a math person. Anybody deals with that? Writing, I'm just not good at writing. It's a gift. Some people have it, some people don't. Artistic expression, talent, is just like that. And so these are the beliefs that we have that really, because we've been told that. We made choices in terms of what majors to do or don't because we're not a math person. They become part of our identity. It's a misstatement now. It's an I am or I am not. And so the bad news from the research is that this one is actually hard to undo in the space that we have in a semester or a quarter. And then finally, good news, I understand what I need to do to get to a place where I want to be. I can do it. Will the environment meet me halfway? Will they support me? I'm going to struggle at some point, even if I try. Will they be there to help me in whichever ways? This is the easy one. Everything that we do in the classroom communicates what kind of environment we want to create for them, whether we're going to be helpful, whether we're going to be encouraging, give good feedback, and so on. And so the questions for me about diversity and inclusion are, what are the expectations of success across different students? Does everybody come in believing that they can succeed? Do we see patterns? Are those patterns relating to something that has been done to them in the school years up to until we got them, messages that they have received over time that have been internalized? And so then how can we help students realign their expectations and communicate to them that we believe in them? 4 and 5, I'm going to do them together because they're about skill acquisition. The skills that we're asking our students to master are complex skills. They're not little itty-bitty things to master. So let's say we want them to be leaders. We want them to be good writers, good communicators. Writing is a big skill. It starts with like grammar and spelling and punctuation and syntax, but then it goes up to like, finding your voice, the organization of your ideas, writing for a certain audience with a certain purpose and a certain genre, style. That's a lot. And so we need to unpack all of that and assess where they are, and then teach them all the component skills that they need. And that's where some people stop and they say, I've given you all the ingredients, you can put them together. The integration is actually a skill in and of itself. People are not naturally good at integrating by themselves. And so they need to try, and they're not going to get it right the first time. So they need guidance and instruction even on that, on how to put things together. And furthermore, they need instruction in knowing when to apply certain things that they have learned, when it makes more sense to apply them versus some other areas. And I've been loose in terms of talking about practice. People need to practice. We say that practice makes perfect. That's actually not true. That is not borne by the research, by the evidence. We've seen our kids go to violin, and after many months, they're still like, it doesn't get any better. You could be practicing bad habits, for instance, and reinforcing them. There is a specific kind of practice that makes perfect. Deliberate practice is what they call it in the field. And it starts with having clear goals. What are we practicing toward? If I'm clear where I want the students to go, then I can design educational opportunities that will get them there. I can design practice opportunities where I can actually see them do it, evaluate what they're doing in relation to the goals, and give them targeted feedback about the pieces that they already have mastered and the pieces that they have not mastered yet, and the steps, the things that they can actually do to fill that gap. And then iterate and iterate and iterate. That's the cycle of progressive improvement. So that's all good. None of this is probably news to anybody in an intuitive sense. I want to talk about something that can be an impediment in doing all of that, the onion and the cycle. Anybody heard of the Stroop effect? Raise your hand. Couple of people, so don't spoil this for everybody else. We're going to do this. So, instructions. I'm going to show some colors on this side, and your task is to name the colors that you see out loud from top to bottom as fast as you can. It's easy. Okay, name the colors you see out loud from top to bottom as fast as you can. There are only 4 colors. So red, yellow, blue, and green. So you don't have to worry about burnt sienna and periwinkle and the color of the year, living coral. Okay, let's give it a try. Practice run. Here on the left, name the colors you see out loud from top to bottom as fast as you can. You did okay, good. So that was the practice run. We'll do another run in the middle. Same task. Name the colors you see out loud from top to bottom as fast as you can. Great. That was even better than the previous one. We're going to do a final try on the right. Same identical task. Name the colors you see out loud from top to bottom as fast as you can. What happened? I broke you again. Who has any idea of what happened here? That's right. So performance-wise, you did worse on the last one. You slowed down, and collectively you made more mistakes. So that's the Stroop effect. It's an interesting psychological puzzle that has been replicated millions of times, every time with this same result. People do better, get faster on the second one, slower, more mistakes on the third one. Okay? Because you are trying to read. But I told you, though, I didn't tell you read, I said name the colors you see. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most of you had figured out that I was going to switch the colors and the letters on you. And in fact, I saw somebody like preparing themselves by closing their ears because you knew that other people would get it wrong and you didn't want to be influenced by them. Very smart. Yeah, I saw you. And still, it didn't work. Why? Why couldn't you turn it off? That is part of expertise. Once we become experts in a skill, and we're all experts at reading because we've been reading for many, many years, that task becomes so automatic that it doesn't need attentional capacities devoted to that. It doesn't need a decision. Okay, I am going to read now. The words come up, and you don't even have to say, okay, B-L, blue, U, blue. They come up to you as already well-formed words. So automaticity. It's great to have automaticity. That means we're going to be so fast at our work. In fact, some people talk about the development of expertise as the journey to unconscious competence. We start here. Unconscious incompetence. We don't even know how much we don't know. We think statistics is easy and I should be allowed to opt out of that because I had a 2-week module in statistics in high school or something. And then you can't opt out, so you stay, and the first thing that happens is you become conscious of your own incompetence. You realize that there's so much more to learn, that there's something to unlearn. That's not a pleasant stage. That's the stage where we give up. Students don't feel like they're moving up. They feel like they're going down. And so it's an emotional stage. There's all kinds of emotions. If you stay with that, you get better. And your knowledge is very conscious to you. Students in this stage have a tendency to talk themselves through. Okay, so every time we did a problem like this in class, in statistics, we always plot the data first. So let me plot the data. Where is it? Okay, which kind of plot is this? Is it a scatter plot? Is this a bar plot? Is it it's a box plot. Okay. The cognitive load is so high that even saying the words help us manage that. Eventually, it becomes unconscious. And in fact, we can say, I can do this in my sleep, right? So this is a model of performance. I want to go to the doctor who can do it in their sleep if I need surgery. I don't want to go to the doctor that can do it, but like, okay, well, the first thing we always did in med school was to cut over here, but not too far down because that's a pancreas, so let me stop there. I don't want that. I want automaticity. Except we're not in the business of performance. We're in the business of teaching. That's why we're here today. And so when we're teachers and we're trying to talk to our students, we're at the stage of unconscious competence. Students are at the stage of unconscious incompetence. There's two unconsciousnesses trying to communicate with each other. It doesn't always work. When you have to go back here and, where am I? Sorry. Unpack and look at all the little component skills. I don't even know what those are. I'm up here. Somebody said, you've been driving for this many years. Can you teach me how to drive? I couldn't. There's a sequence of things that I do when I'm driving, but they're not present to my mind. I couldn't articulate them and say, okay, this is your checklist to this, and then to this, and then to this. I just drive. So the same can happen. We've all had those professors who knew it inside and out and couldn't explain it. So we don't want to be that. It's like we need to invent a new stage after 4, as 5, where we retain all our knowledge, but we're able to reach back to stage 3 and 2 of how it was when we were learning it the first time and what was challenging, what took longer than we expected, what was counterintuitive. We thought it was going to go this way, it went the other way, so we can guide our students. And the literature talks about this as the expert blind spot. We cannot see what students see when they're starting out, because we are at a different altitude. We see something else. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, to me the natural question is, that's one example of a blind spot that we have, a cognitive blind spot. What are some of the blind spots that we have in terms of trying to relate to what students see that we cannot see? Their experiences, taking into account their histories, whether those histories involve marginalization or tokenization or invisibility or hypervisibility, and so on. The bad news about the blind spot research is that you cannot get rid of your blind spot. That's part and parcel of your expertise. It would mean giving up, no longer being an expert. They come together. And so all we can do is be aware that we have blind spots, and that we need to be on the hunt for them. Being open to feedback when other people say, I don't think you're seeing this from the perspective that your students are, and take those messages in. I'm going to skip number 6 and go to 7 and loop back around to 6. So 7 is the metacognitive principle. What needs to happen for students to be able to take responsibility for their own learning? Well, this is what it looks like in my statistics class when I assign a complex project for the end of the semester, or like a capstone where it's a semester-long project. First, I want the students to be able to assess the task. What is it? What is the scientific question that the biologists had in mind when they collected their data? How does that translate to a statistical question? How does the data come in the Excel spreadsheet? Which columns would have the evidence to answer that question? Given the way the data is collected in those columns, what are some of the statistical methods that would be helpful in teasing that evidence out of the data? That's the assess the task. And then I want students to be able to know themselves, evaluate their own strengths and weaknesses. For instance, okay, I understand that in this kind of problem I'm going to need a stepwise regression. But there's a lot of missing data in this problem, and so the computer software that I have does not handle that, so I would have to actually write some code as a workaround to incorporate to deal with that. And that means I'm not really good at coding. I need to give time to debug and test my code. And then after I have everything, I'm going to need to write a report. And I hate writing, so I need to make sure to work from the deadline so I have a draft that I can give to my professor, and they give me feedback, and then I can fix my writing. If we knew ourselves like that, strengths and weaknesses, that's a delightful student to have in class, right? Because immediately, once you know your strengths and weaknesses, that creates a plan. Now I need to work backwards from the deadline so that I have a draft of my report 10 days in, which means I need to have my statistical analysis finished by this so I can write the report, and so on. Once we have all that, we start doing. We apply the strategies that we learn in class, like the stepwise regression and so on. But we are monitoring what is happening to the computer output. Does this make sense? If I'm getting a negative standard deviation, that means something went wrong somewhere. What went wrong? So I'm analyzing, I'm reflecting, I'm adjusting. Was it a bug in the code? This is a bigger conceptualization problem that stepwise regression was really the wrong tool for this. That's why I'm getting numbers that are messed up, that don't make sense at all. Maybe I need to start over. Maybe I just need to look back around to a different plan. I don't know. But I'm doing that cycle. Okay? All aspects of this cycle have been investigated by the research. So we have answers in terms of what tends to happen. Assessing the task. Students don't assess the task. And these are statistical statements. They're about groups. Overall, they don't. Doesn't mean that nobody does, or, but they don't. Like those have been examined in writing classes as well as math classes. In writing classes, they get a sense of the prompt. Oh, it's about this, and then immediately they start writing everything they know about that topic. Or in a math class, they read enough of the problem to say, oh, it's that equation, and then immediately start plugging numbers into that equation. And in fact, in some of the studies, the students that read further out after they had already decided it was that equation, they actually misread some of the next information, like miles instead of minutes, so that it would still fit the equation that they had decided was the right equation to use in that case. Our brains just trick us. We think the brain is so powerful, and it is very powerful. It will trick us if we let it. In terms of evaluating your own strengths and weaknesses, students, people, humans, this is research into human nature, I'm convinced. We are not good, and in general, we err in the direction of overestimating our strengths and downplaying our weaknesses. If you cast it as an estimation problem, which I tend to do as a statistician, so if this is the top and I'm right here, it's easy for me to see, okay, I've got it, I'm just missing a little bit. But if this is the top and I'm sort of in the middle or low, and I'm trying to see how far out I am, that's a much more difficult problem to estimate. And so we're just not good. The first time this was tested that I became aware of it was with nurses, graduating nursing students who all of them thought that they could do an IV. And then they made them do it, and half of them did it wrong. Couldn't find the vein, just pricked the wrong place. But it's not a knock on the nurses because it's been replicated in every field you can think of, and that's the consistent result. People overestimate their strengths. It has a name, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, it has its own Wikipedia page. It's very well documented. Planning. When you put students and experts in the same room to solve complex problems, experts take less time. Obviously, they're experts, they're faster. But most of the expert time is spent understanding the problem and planning a good approach, and then quickly executing the approach. Instead, most students start doing right away instead of planning. Then they get stuck, then they meander, then they need to retrace and backtrack. Some of them get discouraged, abandon it. Some others takes them a longer time because they need to go up and down again. In terms of applying strategies and monitoring, applying strategies is just executing that stepwise regression. But monitoring, really paying attention to what's going on. Are you getting the results that you expected? Did you even have an expectation for what would happen here? And are you able to measure what are you seeing with what you thought would happen? There's a very powerful effect in cognitive psychology called the self-explanation effect, which is those students who spend time explaining things to themselves. Let's say, okay, I just read this chapter, I need to read the next chapter, but before I move on, there was a lot going on in this chapter. Let me explain it back to myself. Let me do a schematic of the main concepts and how they relate to each other and errors. As simple as that. Students who do that, huge learning gains. Except that's a minority of students who does that on their own, unprompted and spontaneously. Most students don't. So now I'm going to quiz you if you've been paying attention. What do you think the research is going to say about reflecting and adjusting? It doesn't happen as a whole. Some people do it and most people don't. Especially if adjusting involves realizing that you need to switch strategies and invest time in learning this whole new strategy. And especially if the old strategy kind of sort of works most of the time, I'm going to cross my fingers and try again. It's even rational in a sense from an efficiency standpoint, just roll the dice and then see if it works again, instead of spending all this time learning a new thing. So we want this. This is our goal, right? We want the students to be able to do this and keep learning, keep teaching themselves, even when they're out of school. None of the pieces that would feed into that happens spontaneously. So that's gloomy research. And part of that is about the students' beliefs about intelligence and learning. Some students believe learning is fast. Either it comes to you immediately or it will never come to you. There's documented beliefs in math where some students believe that if you cannot solve a math problem in 10 minutes, it's impossible to solve. So then why reflect, why adjust, why plan? It doesn't make sense. As well as beliefs about myself. Do I have what it takes to solve this problem? And so when we think about diversity and inclusion, what about what's keeping all our students from learning in our courses? And part of what is happening is not the full story, but is students with internalized beliefs about their own intelligence. Who are they? How did they come to have those beliefs? How can I help? How can I work with them, starting to undo and chip away at that? That's a wall that goes up. None of that cycle will happen until the right beliefs are in place. What now the research calls the growth mindset instead of the fixed mindset. The fixed mindset is, this is what I have to work with, those are my skills, versus the growth mindset is everything can grow, even my mental capacities. If I stretch them, if I try, I'm not going to get it right the first time, but I'll continue doing that. Every failure is a learning opportunity. So how can we help students with a fixed mindset get to the growth mindset? All right. Sixth principle, but I'm saving it last because it talks about basically creating productive learning environments. And it's a twofer. It's the student's own intellectual maturity, not just intellectual, but every kind, as well as the climate in the course and how they interact together to create, to facilitate or to hinder learning and performance. On the development side, again, you could take courses in development, graduate courses, and there's all kinds of development. There's intellectual development, social, spiritual, emotional, interpersonal, intercultural, lots of things. So I'm going to focus on a couple of dimensions. One is intellectual development. And the people who studied this have created sort of a trajectory with stages and steps. And it starts at dualism. Students and people with that mindset believe knowledge to be black and white. Things are either true or false. You go to school to learn all the true stuff. It's actually also a moral and ethical theory. And so you also go to church to learn the good and bad stuff. Do the good stuff, don't do the bad stuff, and you're good. You're a good person. The knowledge is receipt. That's what the feminist critique called it. Because especially if you're a woman, your role at this stage is to just sit down and nod politely and take notes and give it back on the day of the test. That's how we are socialized. Our role is to have all the answers. If we don't, then we're bad teachers. This is what Paulo Freire calls the banking model of education, where professors make little deposits of knowledge into the student's brain, but just like when you go to the bank and put your money in there, it's your money. You can demand it back anytime you want, with a pop quiz at the midterm, etc. And what he says is, his insight is that this model of education only reinforces existing patterns of oppression and exclusion. So we need to change that. But students arrive expecting that kind of model from us, most of our students. And in fact, when we're trying to do things like Socratic dialogue, what do you think? Put it back on them, which is a great pedagogical technique. At this stage, they're not ready to appreciate that strategy. They're like, I don't know what I think. You know, you're the expert, just tell me. I'm just going to spitball for 10 minutes, and I'm still going to get it wrong, and you're going to have to tell me at the end. Just tell me now. Put me out of my misery. Why won't the teacher answer my questions? Eventually, you realize that teachers don't have all the answers, and it doesn't make them bad people. You're able to accommodate that insight, adjusting to the idea that not all knowledge is known. So these are quantitative views on knowledge, where you stack up the knowledge, and that's what it means to know something, to be a learned person. We don't know. Some knowledge is true. Some knowledge we know for sure. Some knowledge we don't know yet. We haven't studied it. The technology is not at that place where we can know for sure. But eventually, technology will progress, and then we will know. Not much has changed in this view other than a partial accommodation. Eventually, you realize that every field has camps, people that disagree with each other. There's enduring disagreements that are irreducible. The ones that were resolvable have been resolved, and people don't talk about those things anymore. But there are still ones that endure. And so then, and for some students, it shifts to, oh, we can never know anything for sure. Experts disagree even among each other. It's all a matter of opinions. That's a discouraging stage. We don't like this stage. Why did I get a C? I only wrote what I believe. How can you grade my feelings? Those are the kinds of questions that we get here, especially from the humanities, right? So it's hard to see how this is a good stage, except two things happen here that are very important for future. They set the stage. One is the openness to diversity. Different people can have different opinions, and that's okay. Which was not present before. Before, there was only one way to think about this. That's the end of the story. And the second thing is that if people can disagree, I can disagree. With the textbook, with the teacher, I can have my own opinions. So that's empowering. It's not harnessed and channeled in a productive way yet, but at least it starts emerging here. When we work with our students and we make them understand that you can have all the opinions that you want, but what matters is the evidence. How you connect it together, how you marshal argument, your point, and interpret the results to make it in a coherent framework. Then we switch to what people call relativism, where knowledge is no longer a quantitative matter, it's a qualitative. It's not about how much facts and factoids you know, it's how you put them together to create a case. Those are the students that we want to have in the classroom. Those are the kind of teachers we want to be. We want to be the teacher that asks, have you thought about this? What about that? Read this other source. It will actually layer another layer of complexity onto that. And students love that. They understand that they learn better when their sources disagree, because it forces them to go deeper. Eventually, you realize that the danger of this stage is paralysis, intellectual paralysis. So in statistics, you could think about the classic paradigm, or you can think about the Bayesian paradigm, and they're different. They have different assumptions and different conclusions in terms of, and which one should you use? None of them is perfect. I can tell you all the pros and cons of this one. I can tell you all the pros and cons of that one. But here's a data set, and I need to pick one of those imperfect approaches and analyze the data to get anywhere. And so you need to commit. Commitment is the next stage. Commitment. Where we understand that we go back to privileging one over other approaches, but because we had thought critically about the whole thing, not because our parents or our teacher or rabbi or priest said, it is so. And the commitment is provisional. We understand that more information might become available at a certain point, and we might change our mind if there is a better story that ties everything together better. And so we understand that knowledge is not just abstract, but there's choices every time we put together the facts and tell a story that has consequences in the real world. So we want to be mindful of that. There is a responsibility that comes with that. Interestingly, different studies. Here's one that had nice data to graph, but there have been other studies, and collectively, they kind of tell a similar story. What stands out of this? These are the same students, male and female, balanced, and follow. So it's a longitudinal study where the educators follow them from their first year on. Every semester they would bring them in and give them an assessment to assess where they were on that scale. And this is what's happening. What do you see?
Not that many people get what we want them to.
The purple is what we want, right? And the purple really struggles all the way through. The blue comes down. At Yale College, blue comes down, that strict black and white way. I'm the only right way of thinking about this. Everybody else is wrong if they have any differences of opinions with me, which is what I basically see every time I turn the TV on right now. So yay for all of us who are doing that kind of work to move students away from that mentality. But the purple doesn't come out. It comes out in year 5, which is after they graduated. They followed them out 1 year. Most of these people graduated and took a job. Some of them went to graduate school. It's only in the real world that when the boss gives you a data set and says, analyze this by Friday, and you're like, oh, by Friday, I kind of know what I'm supposed to do with this data, but it would take me months to do it right because I need to apply, make sure that all the assumptions are verified before I can do the test that I want to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I need it by Friday. So what can I tell? What can I do with this data that's smart, that's intelligent, that allows me to showcase my skills and give my boss what they need, understanding that there might be financial consequences for the company, there's a reputational risk involved if we get this wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When all those pressures come together, that's when development happens. When the pressures of life show you that your current approach is inadequate and you need to level up, basically. So out of this study, this was a very influential study, people realized we need to bring year 5 into college. And so there's very big ways of bringing year 5 into college. Increase study abroad, for instance, right? You're in France now, figure it out. Use your knowledge to feed yourself, find the bathroom, make friends. Undergraduate research, you're in the lab. The knowledge is not in the back of the textbook. You have to create your own knowledge. You have to start with assumptions and hypotheses. You test them. You see if they hold. If not, you have to revise and so on. Internships, go out into the real world. All those things that we've seen grow in part were not out of just this one study, but this study sort of recapitulates that movement of we need to bring experiential learning into the classroom. So those things take lots of people, lots of money. Those are institutional efforts. One person cannot make study abroad happen for the whole university. But also you can think about beyond those big things, if you're not in that particular kind of course that does that, what can you do to bring year 5? So that's one. The second one is a model of social identity development. The process by which all of us members of groups, some groups that are dominant, some groups that are stigmatized or marginalized or marked in any ways, come through with a positive sense of belonging to that group. And there's all kinds of models of development of a black identity, a white identity, a Latino identity, a Jewish identity, a homosexual identity, etc. And they all have commonalities. And so this model kind of abstracts from all those models. And it starts from saying that kids have a naivete stage. And what I mean by that is that they notice differences, but they don't ascribe meaning to those differences. They're just, oh, your skin is darker than mine, whatever. But immediately, people are bombarded with messages from the media, from everywhere, about which groups are better, faster, smarter, more dependable, more beautiful, sinful, etc., etc. And you accept these messages. We all do, because we don't even realize we're being messaged. They are subliminal in some ways. Dominant groups accept them, minority groups accept them, because it's unconscious, the process of socialization. The acceptance can be very active, like violent, like the KKK would be the most active, aggressive example of accepting those kinds of norms, or it could be more passive. But we're all in certain ways in there. Until we see examples of clear injustice that we cannot explain away, is one, or two is until we have experiences of contact with other people from other groups doing meaningful work that break down the stereotypes and say, oh, I thought, people like you were this or that, but you're not like that, and she's not like that, and they're not like that. I guess I was wrong. And so then we start resisting those messages. Again, the resistance can be more active or more passive, but it's a resisting stage. Eventually, you rework everything inside, and it becomes one part of your identity, and it doesn't preclude you working with people from other parts. In college, when the conflict happens that threatens the inclusivity of our environments, is because we have some people powerful and empowered in their resisting stage that are calling out isms, racism, homophobia, this and that and the other. And then there's other people that are still in their acceptance stages, and they're coming to face their privilege, and it's not a pleasant thing. In fact, that stage is called disintegration. Your ego kind of crumbles apart, and you need to rebuild yourself up in a new way. And that creates a lot of conflict. So I'm going to close it with one idea, which is that when we think about climate, we think about good or bad. And I'm not, just bad like those people. I don't invoke the KKK in class like some students in my institution did recently. I don't say the N-word in class, so I'm good. But it's more complex than that. We're all in a continuum. And so, for instance, we could be, those levels are examples of explicitly marginalizing contexts, environments. I work with a professor who would say on the first day, I do not believe in disabilities, do not ask me for accommodations. Right, that's the requisite murmur, because that's illegal, first of all, let alone not inclusive, but it's illegal. So they had a talk with him, so now he's at the implicitly marginalizing stage. He doesn't say that anymore, but it comes through, his disdain for all of that. And then you have levels of implicitly centralizing, where things are happening, but they're not centered or explicitly explained. This is why I'm doing these things in the classroom. Versus all the way trying to create courses that center perspectives that have been marginalized before. The difference is that the onus here is on the students. Students have to take risks to speak up and say they don't know what the professor is going to say, because the professor has never given any indication. And in fact, students assume that because of what they see on the news, unless you make it explicit, they can't really trust you. You have to earn your trust with them. The benefit of the doubt is not there, or like blanket benefit that everybody will be inclusive. You have to earn that to your students, is what research shows. So I will say that, no? I care about this personally, but now we know, it's not just that I care about this, we know that environments that are not perceived as inclusive, they have strong effects on learning. Students don't learn in those environments. It affects critical thinking skills, it affects preparation for a career, it affects all kinds of other academic skills, and that's well documented. So I leave you with that. And I have questions for you. Any questions that you have, or some of these questions about what stands out, Are there implications for your teaching? Are there challenges that they would present? I see what you're saying, but in my class it would be difficult to try to do that because. So we can spend some time. Thank you.
We still have time? Oh, yeah, there's a microphone right in the center of the room there if you want to line up there, or if you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you this one.
Thanks very much for your presentation. It was very enjoyable. I know the theme of today is mostly about inclusivity, but the question I had was actually about the motivation part, was about principle 3. Mm-hmm. I was interested in if you could tell us a little more about what the research shows are best practices to stimulate or increase student motivation. I thought it was interesting the way you broke it out into value and expectancy and the different areas of expectancy, and you mentioned that one area was really hard to address and another area was easier to address. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could talk about what are some best practices for increasing or improving student motivation, or maybe point us, or me personally, this is my question about my teaching potentially, to like what is a good resource to look at for how to do things in the classroom that positively impact student motivation.
Sure. That's a great question. Thank you. Let's see. Chapter 3 of my book, every chapter ends with teaching strategies for each one of the principles. Sort of the guiding principles, without getting into sort of the merit of the specific discipline that you teach and the kinds of students you have, if you're trying to build value, what builds value? Several things. First of all, connections. Connect to students' interests, whether academic or not. So the more you can know about your students and what they value and where they're coming from, and the diversity of your students, because each one brings different things, it quickly becomes daunting, right? Do I have to know all of my students and what they care about and their hobbies and their interests? But that is the principle. But specifically, if you can connect it to professional and pre-professional, this will help you. I know you hate organic chemistry, but that is the thing that will get you into med school, if that's where you want to be. So building that instrumental motivation. You don't have to care about this. I want people to care about math because it's beautiful and elegant. I don't expect everybody to find the beauty in the elegance, but it will get you where you want to go. What other things build motivation? Novelty builds motivation, is documented. Something new, something different, right? Fun, excitement builds motivation. If I'm up here, droning on, that's demotivating. If I can make it exciting in different ways, group activities can build motivation, but only if they are structured well. Because students have grown up with group activities and they hate them because they've all been in those groups that didn't work well, where they had to do all the work, where they had the free riders, etc. So the structure of that is crucial. Complexity is something that builds motivation. The balance of complexity. Not too much that you cannot handle, but we've always assumed in this economics class that money falls out of the sky when we move the supply curve for money. We're going to find out today, actually, how does the Fed actually move that curve up and down. So we're adding an extra layer that solves some of the mystery that so far we had. So that's motivating. Motivation. On the expectancy side, when students don't think that they can do it, what I tell them, and that connects to the last principle about the students' internalized beliefs about themselves and their agency. Not everybody will be Einstein. I don't believe that everybody's the same in terms of that. But what we have is like a rubber band. It can stretch. So whatever you have right now, if you stay with me, if you talk to me and come to me when you have difficulties, we can help you stretch it. Won't get you a Nobel Prize in science. it will allow you to pass college algebra. I promise you that. So building that kind of reassurances can help. And especially working on attributions. And actually, when I work with TAs, I recommend this theory to them because TAs don't have power. They can't change the syllabus, but they can have these kinds of conversations. Everybody can have these kinds of conversations with the students. When we fail, our brain compels us to make a story about why we failed. I bombed the test. Why? And we can have all kinds of reasons. I wasn't feeling well that day. The professor is unfair. They gave us things that were not covered on the test. We have so many stories that we can spin. What the stories have in common is three different things. The locus of control. Who's in charge of that story? Most students tend to externalize and focus on things that have nothing to do with them. Focus on the professor, focus on the roommate that was rowdy and loud all night and they didn't get a good night rest. Things that are unchangeable. I'm just not good at math. It will never change. And so if we can redirect those conversations to what are you in control of, things that you can actually make changes on. Yes, the professor might have been this or that, but let's talk about you. And I find those to be powerful conversations.
I am an adjunct here, and I teach a course that students don't like to take. And for me, just to give you some context, so I was born in Pakistan, and in teachers, they have more authority. By that I mean that parents have given them the authority that they can, beyond the content, they can reach out to students, and if the students complain, parents can say, well, they will make you better. Fast forward, I studied in England, in the US as well. Now that I'm teaching, I want to connect with all my students. I try different ways. I use a tool called Poll Everywhere, where I just open it up and say, for shy students, if you don't want to raise your hand, post your questions over here. I do a pulse, and because this course that I teach has 3 segments, I do a pulse where I tell them where you are, and then for students who are not doing well, I ask them, please reach out to me. I email them separately as well. The problem that I'm facing, where growing up in the East and now living in the West, where as a faculty do I draw the line where I don't get too much in their face, because I'm coming there with passion and empathy. I want to create a relationship with them. Like as of right now, I'm teaching a course, and there are a few students who are just numb. They're not responding. I try to connect with them, email them. The last thing I want is to just sit with them and say, well, you're not replying to my emails, let's talk. And that's the last thing that I can do. But is this the Western side of my teacher saying that, can I be that Pakistani teacher? Well, if I do that, but then I'm like, well, the students say, well, how can I draw the line as a faculty to motivate them, create that climate beyond whatever I've tried, but it's worked for most students, but I just want to connect with everyone. So can you have any suggestions for that, please?
I can try a little bit. It's a complex question. As an immigrant myself from Italy, which also has a much more strict system in terms of where the teacher is positioned, I can relate to what you're saying. Without knowing the details of your course, I can only say some general things. It kind of goes back to motivation, right? Motivation for students to engage and reply to your emails, etc. One of the mistakes that I always caution people against in motivation is to project our own motivation onto our students. We are excited, we love the topic. This is how much we love our topic. I was willing to be poor for 5 years in order to study more statistics. That's a level of motivation that is not reasonable to expect from anybody else that is not me. Now, you might not be motivated to be poor for 5 years, but what does it take you to motivate you to reply to an email, right? It seems like that should be a much more attainable threshold. We're not going to reach all our students. I don't know anybody that works in teaching and learning that makes that kind of promise. If you do this, you will reach everybody. So to me, it comes down to what do I need to do to feel good, to live with myself, that I've done everything that I was able to do. And it sounds like you're already in that, thinking about along those lines. One thing that's helped me, and I don't know if that's your case, but coming from a different cultural environment, and I've seen it with other faculty as well, is that the cultural cues that we're used to, we read them in different ways. And we might read certain things that students do here as a lack of engagement, or as a disrespect, or as anything that we might do that's extra in terms of catering to what students expect. We might feel it as lowering our standards, even be caught like in an ethical dilemma. I can't do what they want because that means I would be sort of betraying. I'm the steward of my field. And I try to not let it go there for me. And instead to just take it to a place of this is all culturally bound and constructed. Students have different expectations. The more I understand about those, the more I can cater to them and it will draw them in. Beyond that, I would have to do like a consultation, come visit your class, come talk to your students to understand more. But those are the main principles.
So I think we have time for one more question. I saw Sister Betty Ann had something in mind. So quick question and a couple minutes for an answer.
Thanks for your enlightening presentation. For the application of the principles, is there a difference between teaching face-to-face in the classroom and teaching online? And if so, could you just comment on which of the principles we should focus on for online teaching? Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. The principles are all still important. It's the balance that might change. They are also important. They are happening, when I go and take a yoga class and I'm trying to learn a new yoga pose, they're still all relevant. When you move online, the things that matter more, it seems to be what the research says is online will bring a whole new set of students to you. Will bring a new set of students to you because it creates access to students that you would not have normally seen. And so in terms of understanding who those students are, what do they bring, what's their previous educational history, what's their context, that would be important to understand. The constraints that they have on their time, etc. Just their prior knowledge in that sense. Their readiness to work online with technology and so on. The other principle that becomes important is the climate. Because now we're trying to create a climate, but it's a virtual climate where students don't even see other faces and other, and in some ways it can be a blessing. Like I don't know who's saying what, and I cannot say, oh, you're just saying that because you're a woman, things like that. So it cuts through a lot of that. But at the same time, what it creates is it creates isolation. And we know that learning is a communal enterprise. And so a lot of students drop out of online at higher rates. And part of that is that they don't have the safety net. A lot of students, there was an influential study of why students leave the sciences. And so they interviewed students who did and who didn't. And the thing that they had in common, or they all had like a moment of crisis. Ooh, maybe I'm not cut off for this. And the thing that made the difference is the ones who stayed mentioned a particular faculty member who brought them back from the edge. And that is a much harder thing to develop in an online environment. So I would focus on building presence in the online environment so that they know you're there for them.